In a city full of life, she walked alone, haunted by the past. Elizabeth moved through the bustling streets with quiet determination. The world around her buzzed with activity, cars honking, laughter spilling from cafes, neon signs flickering against the night sky. Yet, she remained untouched by the liveliness, as though she existed in a different realm altogether. Her thoughts were heavy, her steps deliberate. Elizabeth worked as a housekeeper for 3 young men, Jason, Mark, and Luke, who had come to see her as part of their family. She was kind, meticulous, and always there when they needed her. But there was something about Elizabeth that the boys couldn't quite figure out. Once every month, she would request the same night off. She gave no reason and offered no explanation. The boys respected her privacy, but they couldn't help but notice how tense she became in the days leading up to her leave. Her behavior was puzzling. She would glance at the calendar repeatedly, her hands trembling as she worked. Her eyes held a distant look, as though she was bracing herself for something only she understood. It was a full moon night when everything changed. Elizabeth, as always, was preparing to leave just before sunset. She moved quickly, her eyes darting to the windows where the last rays of sunlight faded. But as she reached for her coat, Mark suddenly collapsed. His fever was dangerously high, and his breaths were shallow. "Elizabeth, please stay," Jason begged, his voice filled with worry. Elizabeth hesitated. Her hand froze on the doorknob. Her face betrayed the conflict within her, a silent battle between the urgency to leave and her loyalty to the boys. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "I'll stay," she said softly, "but you must promise me. If I need to go later, let me." The boys agreed, too worried about Mark to question her odd request. As the night deepened, the house grew quieter. The moon climbed high in the sky, its silver light pouring through the windows and casting long, eerie shadows. Elizabeth paced in her room, her hands clasped tightly. She felt the pull stronger than ever. Midnight approached, and the house was still. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock. Elizabeth sat on the edge of her bed, her breathing unsteady. Then a soft knock came at the door. The sound made her heart race. Slowly she stood and walked toward it, her legs trembling with each step. When she opened the door, she froze. A large black snake lay at her feet, its scales glistening like polished obsidian under the moonlight. Its eyes, deep and unblinking, seemed to recognize her. Elizabeth's fear melted into something else. Relief. She knelt on the floor, her hands trembling as tears streamed down her face. "You came," she whispered. The snake slithered inside, its movements smooth and deliberate. Elizabeth rolled up her trouser leg, revealing scars, thin pale lines that told a story of countless bites. The snake coiled around her leg, its touch familiar, almost comforting. It bit her gently, and Elizabeth gasped, collapsing onto the bed. Her breathing slowed, and her face relaxed into a serene expression. Luke, who had been restless and unable to sleep, heard strange noises coming from Elizabeth's room. Curious, he walked down the hallway and pushed the door open. What he saw made him freeze in shock. The massive snake was wrapped around Elizabeth's leg, its fangs buried in her skin. "Jason, Mark, get in here," Luke shouted, his voice trembling. The boys came running, and Jason, without thinking, grabbed a stick. He swung it with all his strength, striking the snake until it fell lifeless to the floor. Elizabeth stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw the snake's lifeless body, a heart-wrenching cry escaped her lips. Why did you kill him?" she whispered, her voice shaking with grief. "He came for me." Her body convulsed, and her eyes closed once more. The boys, panicked, called a doctor. When he arrived, it was too late. Elizabeth was gone. The doctor examined her leg and noticed the scars. "These marks," he said, puzzled, "aren't from tonight. They're old, very old." The boys stood in silence, their faces pale as they tried to process what had happened. "She didn't die from the bite," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. "She died because we killed the snake." As the weight of their actions sank in, the truth began to unravel. Elizabeth had been searching for her husband, Nathan, for years. He hadn't disappeared in the forest all those years ago. He had been cursed. Nathan had been transformed into a snake, bound to return to Elizabeth on every full moon. It was their secret, a bond that defied nature and the curse itself. But by killing the snake, the boys had broken that bond. Elizabeth hadn't just lost Nathan. She had lost the fragile connection that kept her alive. As the full moon shone brightly over the house, an eerie silence filled the air. Outside, in the garden, something moved. A shadow slithered across the grass. A snake, its eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. The curse wasn't over. Nathan would return, and this time he wouldn't come alone.